The smoke alarm went off at 6:47 in the morning, which was, Charlie Bennett would later insist, a personal record. Woodstock, Vermont, at that hour was the kind of quiet that made a person believe, briefly, in the goodness of small towns. Mist still clinging to the covered bridge down the block, the general store's lights not yet on, frost silvering the edges of the maple leaves that hadn't fallen yet. Charlie had been up since 5, the way he was every Saturday, moving through the dim bakery kitchen by muscle memory alone. Flour into the mixer, butter softening on the counter, the oven ticking as it came up to temperature. He liked this hour best, the hush of it, the way the whole town seemed to be holding its breath before the day started in earnest. He was 26 years old, still not entirely used to being called the owner instead of the owner's son, and he had only turned his back for 90 seconds, to answer a call from his cousin about whether the bakery's front window should go full pumpkin and hay bale for the season or lean tasteful with a single wreath of dried corn husks. And in that time the tray of cinnamon rolls he'd been proofing on top of the industrial oven had slid, very slowly and very dramatically, directly onto the open flame beneath the stovetop. By the time Charlie spun around, phone still pressed to his ear, a column of black smoke was curling toward the exposed brick ceiling of Bennett's bakery, like it had somewhere important to be. "I have to go," he said into the phone, already grabbing the fire extinguisher bolted beside the walk-in fridge. "The bakery's on fire." "What?" He hung up. The extinguisher hissed white foam across the stovetop, and for a moment Charlie thought he had it handled, right up until the smoke alarm's shriek was joined by a second, louder sound. Sirens, entirely too close, entirely too fast, rising and falling against the quiet of Woodstock's main street like the town itself had gasped. "Oh, come on," Charlie muttered, staring at the small, mostly extinguished fire that had, apparently, been significant enough to trip the building's monitored alarm system straight to the fire department. "It's basically out. It's fine. It's—" The front door of the bakery banged open, and in came 6 feet and a couple inches of trouble. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that filled out his dark blue uniform without trying, hair cropped short and dark, jaw set with the kind of focus that belonged on the cover of a rescue calendar Charlie's aunt would absolutely have bought. He had an axe, an actual axe, held loose and easy in one gloved hand, like he was fully prepared to chop his way through a wall of croissants if the situation called for it. "Everyone out," the man barked, scanning the small bakery with sharp gray eyes. "Is anyone else inside?" "Just me," Charlie said, lowering the extinguisher, acutely aware that he was covered head to toe in flour, soot, and, he realized with dawning horror, the remains of an exploded bag of powdered sugar that had gone off like a landmine when he'd knocked into the prep counter mid-panic. "And, it's out. See?" He gestured weakly at the blackened, foam-covered tray. "Very small fire, practically a large candle." The firefighter's gaze moved from the tray to Charlie, taking in the flour, the soot, the powdered sugar dusted like snow across his shoulders, and something in his stern expression flickered. Not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. "You're on fire," he said. "I just told you it's—" "No." The man stepped forward fast, and before Charlie could process what was happening, a gloved hand was patting firmly at his left shoulder, where, Charlie twisted his head to look, a small, cheerful flame was in fact eating its way through the sleeve of his flour-dusted apron. "Oh," Charlie said, with the calm of a man whose brain had simply declined to panic about one more thing. "That's new." The firefighter patted the flame out in 3 efficient smacks, leaving Charlie standing there in a scorched apron, coated in white powder like the world's saddest powdered donut, staring up into a face that belonged nowhere near a burning bakery at 7 in the morning, or possibly anywhere, ever, given how distractingly good it looked under a fire helmet. "You're new," Charlie blurted, because his brain, having declined to panic, had apparently also declined to filter. "Grant Sullivan," the man said, "new fire chief, transferred in from Boston 2 weeks ago." He glanced around at the scorched stovetop, the foam, the sugar explosion radius, and Charlie followed his gaze, the words Bennett's Bakery stenciled in gold on the front window. "And you're the guy who called in a structure fire and then tried to fight a 5-alarm blaze with a hand extinguisher and no shoes." Charlie looked down. He was, in fact, not wearing shoes. "To be fair," Charlie said, "it wasn't a 5-alarm blaze. It set off a monitored alarm to my station 3 miles away." "That's a very sensitive alarm." Behind Grant, 2 more firefighters had crowded through the door. One young and freckled, grinning like Christmas, had come early, the other older, with a mustache that seemed to be doing most of the talking for him. The younger one, who couldn't have been more than 24, elbowed the mustached one and stage whispered, "Chief's blushing," which was not true. Charlie was almost positive, except that when he glanced back at Grant Sullivan's face, there was in fact a faint, stubborn color climbing up from his collar. "I'm not blushing, Toby," Grant said without turning around. "I'm standing near an active heat source." "The heat source is out, Chief," said Toby, unhelpfully, already grinning at Hank like the two of them had found the day's entertainment early. Charlie decided in that moment, standing in the wreckage of his 60-dozen Saturday cinnamon roll order, covered in sugar and small burns, that this was possibly the single most humiliating morning of his adult life. He thought about his mother, briefly and absurdly, the way he still did at odd moments, what she would have said, watching her son stand barefoot and smoking gently at the edges in front of the best-looking stranger to ever walk through that door. "Well, sweetheart," he could almost hear her say, in that dry, fond voice she'd used whenever life handed him something ridiculous, "you always did know how to make an entrance." "Sir?" Grant said, and Charlie realized he'd been staring off into space for several seconds too long. "You with us? Sorry. Yes." "Present." Charlie shook himself back into the moment. "Just processing the fact that I set myself on fire before 8 a.m. Happens more than you'd think," Grant said, and this time the almost smile made it all the way to a real one, brief and startling, like sun breaking through cloud cover. "Not the shoulder part. People usually manage to keep their eyebrows. Good to know for next time," Charlie said without thinking, and then immediately wanted to sink through the floor. "Not that there's going to be a next time. I'm very responsible, generally." Something flickered across Grant's face, surprise, and something warmer underneath it, before Toby called him back toward the truck to log the incident, and the moment dissolved into procedure, statements, forms, the particular tedium of paperwork after chaos. But Charlie caught Grant glancing back at him twice on his way out, quick and almost involuntary, and felt something unfamiliar and hopeful lodge itself quietly under his ribs. It would not, however, remain the most memorable thing about that morning for very long. They made him sit outside on the curb wrapped in a scratchy gray blanket, while Toby and Hank checked the electrical panel and confirmed there was no structural risk, just a very determined grease fire and one destroyed batch of cinnamon rolls. Grant crouched down in front of him, forearms braced on his knees, closer than strictly necessary for a fire safety debrief. "You inhaled some smoke," he said. "How's your breathing?" "Fine," Charlie said. Then, because his chest did actually feel tight, he coughed, a real cough, sharp and sudden, that folded him half forward. Grant's hand came up to his back before Charlie had even finished processing the impulse to double over, warm and broad between his shoulder blades, steadying him, and that should have been nothing. A basic first responder instinct. Hands on backs, that was probably in the manual. Except the second Grant touched him, something happened that was not in any manual Charlie had ever heard of. It started at the base of his spine, right where Grant's palm rested, and moved up through him like a struck match. A warmth that had nothing to do with the extinguished fire and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming awareness of exactly how close this stranger was standing. Charlie's next breath came in on the scent of him, leather and wood smoke and something warmer underneath, cedar maybe, or fresh ground coffee, something that made his skin prickle and his pulse do something complicated and undignified in his throat. He looked up. Grant was already looking at him, not the polite, professional concern from 30 seconds ago, but something stunned, something that had gone very still and very focused, gray eyes fixed on Charlie's face like he'd forgotten there was an entire fire crew standing 6 feet away. "You," Grant started and stopped. Neither of them moved. The morning kept happening around them. Toby dragging a hose back to the truck, Hank radioing something about an all clear, an elderly woman across the street opening her shop with her hand pressed flat over her heart like she'd just witnessed the beginning of a very good story. But for Charlie, all of it went soft and distant, background noise behind the roar of his own pulse. He knew what this was. Everyone knew what this was, in the abstract, the way you knew about lightning strikes or winning the lottery. A thing that happened to someone, somewhere, a scent recognition so total and immediate it rewired a person's whole nervous system in a single breath. Omegas talked about it in hushed, half-joking voices, the way you talked about ghosts. You'll know, his mother used to say, stirring batter with the same wooden spoon she'd used his whole childhood. When it's real, you won't have to ask. Charlie was not asking. Grant's jaw worked once, like he was chewing on words too big to say out loud, and his hand, still resting between Charlie's shoulder blades, flexed, just slightly, like he had to consciously remind it not to pull Charlie closer. Chief. Toby's voice cracked the moment wide open. Insurance company's on the line, they want the incident number. Grant closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, the stunned openness was gone, tucked back behind something careful and professional, though his hand lingered on Charlie's back a beat longer than the retreat required. Right, Grant said, voice rougher than it had been a minute ago. He stood, and Charlie felt the absence of his hand like a held breath let go. Someone will follow up, about the report. Sure, Charlie said, and hated how breathless it came out. Grant walked backward toward the truck for 3 full steps, before he seemed to realize what he was doing, turned, and strode the rest of the way without looking back. Charlie sat on the curb in his scratchy blanket, heart going like a rabbit's, and thought, well, there goes my whole life plan. He watched the truck pull away, lights still turning lazily even without the siren, and became aware, slowly, that the elderly woman across the street, Eleanor, though he didn't know her name yet, was still watching him with her hand pressed to her heart, beaming like she'd personally arranged the entire morning as a treat. Charlie gave her an awkward little wave. She waved back with the enthusiasm of someone who had just watched the opening scene of a movie she intended to enjoy thoroughly. His phone buzzed in his pocket, his cousin, texting in all caps, "Is the bakery okay? Did you die?" And Charlie realized he was still sitting on the curb in bare feet, blanket around his shoulders like a very confused superhero, grinning at nothing in particular. Whatever had just happened to him, whatever that had been, the scent, the stillness, the way his whole body had leaned toward a stranger without his permission. He had the distinct sense that his life had just quietly, irreversibly changed shape. And he wasn't at all sure yet whether that was a good thing or a terrifying one. Possibly, he thought, both. By 10 a.m., half of Woodstock knew there'd been a fire at Bennett's bakery. By noon, thanks to Eleanor Whitfield, 71 years old, proprietor of the general store on the corner and the single most efficient information network east of the Mississippi, half the town also knew that the new fire chief had, in Eleanor's words, looked at that boy like Christmas came early. Charlie spent the morning mopping foam off the floor and fielding a steady stream of concerned regulars who wandered in under the thin pretense of buying muffins and stayed to ask increasingly detailed questions about the fire, the firefighters, and, with an unsubtlety that would have been impressive if it weren't so exhausting, whether the new chief was single. By the time the lunch rush faded, Charlie had fielded the same question in 6 different phrasings and was fairly sure his ears were permanently pink. I did not hear him say that. Charlie told Nora Kim, who was sweeping soot out from under the display case with the particular vigor of a woman delighted by gossip. Nora, 27, sharp-eyed, and permanently unimpressed by nonsense that wasn't her own, had been Charlie's best friend since the 2nd grade, back when she'd punched a kid for calling him a crybaby, and then made him split her fruit snacks as an apology for getting them both sent to the principal's office. She'd been working the counter at Bennett's for 3 years now, ever since Charlie inherited the place from his mother, and she had approximately 0 filter. Eleanor didn't need to hear it, Nora said. Eleanor has been reading rooms since before either of our parents were born. Also, I heard it from Hank's wife, who heard it from Hank, who was standing right there. There was smoke. People say things in smoke. Charlie. Nora stopped sweeping and looked at him. Really looked, the way she did when she was about to say something he wouldn't want to hear but needed to. You smelled it. I can see it on your face right now. You smelled cedar. Charlie did not answer that because he had, in fact, spent the better part of the morning trying not to think about cedar, and failing spectacularly. The bell over the door chimed at 2:10, and Charlie looked up expecting a customer and found, instead, Grant Sullivan standing in the doorway in civilian clothes, jeans, a soft gray Henley that did nothing to disguise the shoulders underneath it, holding a clipboard like a shield. Fire safety follow-up, Grant said a little too fast. State requires an inspection within 48 hours of any monitored alarm response. For the report, Nora, without a shred of subtlety, announced that she was going to go check the walk-in and vanished into the back so fast Charlie heard the door swing twice. "Right," Charlie said. "The report." "The report," Grant agreed, and neither of them moved for a long moment, both very interested in the clipboard. "Do you want—" Charlie started. "Could I—" Grant said at the same time. They both stopped. Grant huffed something that was almost a laugh, and the sound of it did something warm and unreasonable to Charlie's chest. "You go," Grant said. "I was going to ask if you wanted a cinnamon roll, the ones that didn't die tragically this morning." Charlie gestured to the fresh batch cooling on the rack, glaze still glistening, steam still curling faintly off the tops. "Least I can do, since you saved my bakery, and possibly my eyebrows." Charlie plated one, and their fingers brushed when Grant took it. Brief, electric, entirely too significant for something so small, and Charlie watched, unreasonably invested, as Grant took a bite. Whatever Grant had been about to say next died on his face, replaced by something closer to reverence. "Okay," Grant said, mouth still half full. "This is the best thing I've eaten since I moved here. High bar. Woodstock's Diner does a mean plate of pancakes. Their pancakes taste like sadness and regret." Grant took another bite, and Charlie watched his throat move when he swallowed, and firmly told himself to stop watching Grant's throat. "This is," he gestured with the rest of the roll, searching for a word. "This is like something my grandmother used to make. Before—" He stopped. "Before?" Grant's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Long story." "I've got a whole bakery of them," Charlie offered, gentler than he meant to. "Long stories, I mean. Not, well, also cinnamon rolls." Grant looked at him then, really looked, the same stunned focus from that morning creeping back into his eyes, and Charlie felt the pull of it low in his stomach, warm and terrifying. "Maybe I'll take you up on that sometime," Grant said. "The story, not just the roll." "I'd like that," Charlie said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in a long time. Grant lingered another 20 minutes, ostensibly finishing his clipboard notes, though Charlie noticed he wrote almost nothing down the entire time. He asked about the bakery's hours, and then, transparently, whether Charlie ever closed early, and then, even more transparently, what Charlie usually did on Sunday afternoons. Questions that circled a request neither of them was quite brave enough to name yet. "You could just ask me to get coffee," Charlie said finally, taking pity on him. Grant went very still. "Could I? You could try, Charlie Bennett." Grant set the clipboard down like it had personally betrayed him. "Would you like to get coffee with me sometime that isn't a fire safety follow-up?" "I would," Charlie said, delighted, "though I make better coffee than anywhere in this town, so you're going to have to actually take me somewhere to make it count." "Duly noted," Grant said, and when he finally left, the bell chiming behind him, Charlie stood at the counter for a full minute, just grinning at nothing, until Nora reappeared from the back with her arms crossed and an expression that said she'd heard every word. "So," she said, "don't. I'm just going to need a full report by Monday," Nora said, already reaching for her broom. "In writing, if possible, with diagrams." He came back 3 days later. Not for a follow-up inspection. Charlie checked. There was no such thing as a second follow-up inspection. Nora looked it up out of pure nosiness. But because, Grant said, standing a little too straight in the doorway, he'd been in the neighborhood. The neighborhood in question was a 15-minute drive from the fire station. "You were in the neighborhood," Charlie repeated, unable to keep the smile off his face as he wiped down the counter. "I was thinking about being in the neighborhood," Grant amended, which was somehow worse and better, and Charlie had to look down at the counter to hide how pleased he was. He'd changed out of uniform for the occasion. Charlie noticed. Jeans instead of the dark blue slacks, a jacket that looked deliberately chosen rather than grabbed off a hook, and there was something disarming about seeing him like this. Off-duty and slightly unsure of himself, none of the crisp authority from the fire scene, just a man who had clearly rehearsed an excuse to visit a bakery on his day off and then delivered it badly anyway. "Well," Charlie said, taking pity on him, "since you're here, neighborhood adjacent, sit down before you talk yourself out of it." It became a pattern in the days that followed. Grant would show up in the slow hour after the lunch rush when Nora had gone to pick up her niece from preschool, and the bakery had gone quiet and gold with afternoon light, and he'd sit at the little corner table with a coffee and whatever Charlie put in front of him, and they would talk about nothing. At first, the weather and the town, and which houses on Elm Street had the best Halloween displays, and then, slowly, about everything. Charlie learned that Grant was 29, that he'd grown up outside Boston, the son and grandson of firefighters, in a house that had smelled permanently of wood smoke and boot polish. He learned that Grant's father had died on a call when Grant was 19, a warehouse fire, a collapsed roof, 6 seconds of bad luck that had rearranged the rest of Grant's life around a single decision to finish training and take up the family trade rather than run from it. "Everyone thought I'd quit," Grant said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite looking at Charlie after. "My mom wanted me to, but it felt like he searched for it. Like leaving would mean he died for nothing. Like the only way to make sense of it was to become the kind of person who runs toward the fire instead of away. That's not really an answer to grief," Charlie said carefully. "That's a way of not having to sit with it." Grant looked up, surprised. "I'm not saying you're wrong to do it," Charlie added quickly. "I'm just saying I know something about that, not the fire part. The running toward work instead of grief part. Your mom," Grant said, not a question. Charlie nodded, throat tight. "She died 2 years ago. Cancer. I took over the bakery because," he laughed, short and a little broken, "because it felt like if I stopped baking her recipes, some part of her would actually be gone, like I owed her a bakery full of proof that she existed. I still have her recipe box, right there." He nodded toward a battered tin box on the shelf above the register, its corners worn soft and silver with handling. "I haven't changed a single recipe in it, not one. Even the ones I know could be better." "Tell me about him," Charlie said gently. "Your dad, if you want to." Grant was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. "He used to let me ride along on the truck when I was a kid, on the slow calls, cats in trees, that kind of thing. He had this laugh that filled up a whole room. My mom used to say you could hear him coming before you saw him, a faint, unguarded smile. He taught me how to tie my boots the department way before I was old enough for kindergarten. I still tie them that way, every morning. It's stupid. It's not stupid." "It's a little stupid," Grant said, but he was still smiling, and Charlie understood, watching him, that this was a story Grant didn't tell often, that the telling of it, here, in this quiet golden kitchen, was its own kind of gift. Grant reached across the small table, slow enough that Charlie could have pulled away, and covered Charlie's hand with his own. It was warm and rough at the knuckles in the particular way of someone who worked with his hands, and Charlie's whole body lit up like the moment the smoke alarm had first gone off. Except this time, nothing was burning except him. "She'd be proud of this place," Grant said quietly. "I only met you a week ago, and even I can tell that." Charlie's eyes stung, unexpectedly, and he laughed to cover it. "You're supposed to be a scary fire chief, very stoic, axe-wielding. This is false advertising. I contain multitudes," Grant said, and the corner of his mouth curved up, and Charlie thought that he was in a significant amount of trouble. The Woodstock Harvest Festival happened every October on the town green, and every year, without fail, Eleanor Whitfield ran the pie-eating contest sign-up table like a woman running a small but ruthless empire. "You're doing the pears contest," Eleanor informed Charlie, 2 weeks after that afternoon in the bakery, pen already poised over the sign-up sheet. "I'm not doing the pears contest. You're doing the pears contest with the fire chief, Eleanor. He already signed up." Eleanor turned the clipboard around with the triumphant air of a woman laying down a winning hand of cards, and there, in surprisingly neat block letters, was Grant Sullivan, partner, Carly Bennett, TB, but probably yes. "He wrote probably yes," Charlie said, torn between horror and helpless delight. "He's an optimist," Eleanor said. "Go find him. He's by the dunk tank, pretending Toby isn't trying to talk him into going in it." The festival grounds smelled like caramel apples and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of trampled grass, strings of orange lights looping between the maple trees, a hay bale maze for the kids roped off near the gazebo. Charlie wound his way past the pie table, the honey stand, a booth where the Woodstock Historical Society was selling raffle tickets for a quilt nobody actually wanted but everyone bought anyway out of civic duty, until he found Grant exactly where predicted, arms crossed, valiantly resisting Toby Reyes's very determined campaign to get him into swim trunks and a dunk tank for charity. "Absolutely not," Grant was saying. "It's for the Children's Hospital, Chief. I give money to the Children's Hospital. I do not give my dignity to the Children's Hospital." "I hear," Charlie said, sliding up beside them, the crisp October air smelling of cider and wood smoke and fried dough, "that you signed us up for something." Grant turned, and the flush that climbed up his neck was deeply, thoroughly satisfying to witness. Eleanor said it would be good publicity. For the department, community relations. Pie eating is community relations. She's very persuasive. She's very terrifying. Toby put in, then, catching Charlie's eye, added in a stage whisper loud enough for the entire dunk tank line to hear. Also, for the record, he's been talking about you non-stop for 2 weeks. I had to hear about your cinnamon rolls at 6 a.m. during shift change. 6 a.m., Charlie. That is a gross exaggeration, Grant said, going the particular shade of red that Charlie was quickly learning to treasure. It is not, Toby said. Hank kept a tally. Show him the tally, Hank. Hank, mercifully, did not have the tally on him, or at least claimed not to, and Grant took the opportunity to steer Charlie firmly toward the pie table before his second-in-command could produce any further evidence. They lost the pie-eating contest spectacularly. Charlie was laughing too hard to actually eat any pie, mostly because Grant, despite being an objectively competent adult who ran into burning buildings for a living, could not for the life of him figure out how to eat a pie without using his hands, and ended up with an entire face of blueberry filling within the first 30 seconds. You have. Charlie gestured helplessly at all of Grant's face. Everywhere. You have it everywhere. Is it a good look? It's a devastating look, actually, Charlie said, before his brain caught up with his mouth, and then it was his turn to go red. Grant went very still, blueberry-smeared and grinning, and reached over. Slow, giving Charlie every chance to step back, which Charlie did not take, and brushed his thumb along the corner of Charlie's mouth. You had some too, Grant said, voice low, and it took Charlie a full 3 seconds to realize Grant had just eaten a smear of pie filling off his own thumb, eyes on Charlie the entire time, and that the roar of the crowd around the dunk tank had gone very far away. That's... Charlie's voice came out, thinner than intended. That's disgusting. You're not wrong, Grant agreed, not moving away. Neither was he. It was Nora, 3 feet away, loudly announcing, I'm going to go win us a stuffed bear at the ring toss. Please continue whatever this is without me. That finally broke the moment, and Charlie laughed, a real, helpless laugh, and reached for Grant's hand without entirely deciding to. Grant laced their fingers together like he'd been waiting all week for permission. They walked the rest of the festival that way, hand in hand, past the corn maze and the cider stand, and Eleanor's smug, satisfied smile, past a scarecrow contest and a table of jarred honey, and a fiddler playing something slow and sweet near the gazebo. They got lost in the corn maze on purpose, or at least Charlie was fairly sure it was on purpose, given how many times Grant accidentally led them down the same dead end just to buy a few more minutes of the two of them alone between the tall, rustling stalks, gold light slanting low through the leaves. Somewhere near the maze's third wrong turn, Grant stopped walking entirely, turned Charlie gently by the shoulder, and just looked at him for a long moment, cider-flushed cheeks, hair mussed by the wind, a stray thread of corn silk caught in his eyelashes, like he was trying to memorize the exact composition of the afternoon. What? Charlie asked, self-conscious under the weight of it. Nothing, Grant said. Just, this is a good day. I wanted to notice it while it was happening. They found their way out eventually, laughing, cider cups long empty, and Charlie thought that this, exactly this, sticky and ridiculous and warm all the way through, was the first time in 2 years he'd felt something close to happy without an asterisk attached. 2 weeks later, Grant showed up at closing time with a request that made Charlie laugh so hard he had to sit down. You want me to what? Teach me to bake, Grant said, entirely serious, standing in the doorway with his uniform jacket over one arm. Something. Anything. My sister's birthday is next month, and I want to bring her something that isn't store-bought, and you're the only baker I know, and also... He hesitated. I wanted an excuse to come by after hours, when it's just us. You didn't need an excuse, Charlie said, softer than he meant to, and something eased in Grant's shoulders like he'd been braced for rejection. He was, it turned out, a genuinely terrible baker, heavy-handed with flour, incapable of resisting the urge to overmix, prone to opening the oven door to check on things far too often, narrating his own mistakes in the same low, serious voice he probably used for incident reports. Structural integrity compromised, he announced solemnly, holding up a cookie that had spread into something closer to a pancake. Requesting backup. You cannot treat cookie dough like a crime scene. Grant. Everything is a crime scene if you look closely enough. He squinted at the mixing bowl with real suspicion. This butter looks unusually soft. Was that supposed to happen? Yes, Grant. That's called room temperature. I'm just asking questions. Charlie showed him how to level a measuring cup instead of eyeballing it, how to fold rather than stir once the flour went in, how to tell by smell alone when something in the oven was 30 seconds from perfect. A skill Grant found almost supernatural and said so, loudly, until Charlie pointed out that Grant did the exact same thing with smoke, reading a fire's whole story from a single whiff of it, and Grant went quiet and thoughtful in a way that made Charlie's chest ache with fondness. My sister used to bake with our grandmother every Sunday, Grant offered, unprompted, scraping dough off his knuckles. I was always outside with my dad, learning knots and hose drills instead. I think some part of me has always wanted to know what I missed. He glanced sideways at Charlie, a little sheepish. Turns out what I missed was mostly flour in unexpected places. That tracks, Charlie said, though for the record, you're doing better than my first month running this place solo. I once forgot the sugar in an entire wedding cake. What happened? I told the bride it was a rustic, less sweet interpretation. She left me a 5-star review anyway. Small towns are very forgiving. I'm learning that, Grant said, looking at him in a way that made it clear he wasn't only talking about cake, but he was patient with himself in a way Charlie hadn't expected, and he laughed easily at his own failures. And by the time they had a batch of very lopsided but edible chocolate chip cookies in the oven, the kitchen was dusted white with flour, and both of them were breathless with laughing. You have. Charlie reached up without thinking, and brushed a streak of flour off Grant's cheekbone, and the laughter between them slowed, then stopped. Grant's hand came up and caught Charlie's wrist, gentle, holding it there against his own face for a moment before turning his head just enough to press a kiss to the inside of Charlie's palm. Charlie, Grant said, low, and the kitchen light caught the gray of his eyes and made them look almost silver. I need to tell you something, and I need you to not run out of the room because I've been sitting on this for weeks now, and if I don't say it, I'm going to combust, which, given my job, would be extremely embarrassing. Charlie's heart was going so hard he thought Grant might be able to hear it. Okay, that first day, when I touched your back. Grant's thumb traced small, absent circles against Charlie's wrist. I've been a firefighter for 8 years. I've pulled dozens of people out of dozens of fires. I have never, not once, felt what I felt when I touched you. His voice dropped, rougher. I think you're my mate. I think I knew it in about 4 seconds, and I have been trying to be responsible and not scare you off with that information, and I am extremely bad at it. The kitchen timer went off behind them, a shrill, ordinary sound that neither of them acknowledged, and Charlie, flour-streaked and breathless, closed the last 6 inches between them and kissed him. It was soft at first, careful, both of them a little stunned by their own daring, and then Grant's hand slid up into Charlie's hair and the careful part dissolved into something deeper, something that tasted like sugar and cedar and every unspoken week between the fire and now. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both breathing hard, Grant said, "For the record, I knew too. 4 seconds, maybe 3. The cookies are burning," Charlie said, laughing against his mouth. "Let them burn," Grant said, and kissed him again. They did, in fact, let them burn, just a little, just at the edges, and neither of them minded even slightly. Charlie boxed up the scorched, lopsided batch anyway because Grant insisted on bringing them home, and because he admitted, sheepish, at the door, he wanted to keep the first thing he'd ever baked for someone who mattered, even if it wasn't very good. "It's a little burnt," Charlie warned. "So am I," Grant said, entirely too pleased with himself, and Charlie shoved him out the door, still laughing. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a silver convertible parked crookedly outside Bennett's Bakery, and a man Charlie hadn't seen in 3 years climbing out of it like he owned the sidewalk. Derek Malone, 28 now, though he still carried himself like the golden boy of some fraternity he'd left behind a decade ago, had been Charlie's boyfriend for 2 years back in Burlington, before Charlie's mother got sick and Charlie moved home to take care of her. Derek had responded to that decision by very calmly explaining that long distance wasn't his thing and disappearing from Charlie's life within the month. A departure Charlie had eventually understood, with the clarity of hindsight, as the natural end point of a charm that curdled into cruelty the second things got difficult. Charlie Bennett, Derek said now, all white teeth and expensive sunglasses, still slinging pastries in the sticks, huh, Derek? Charlie's voice came out flatter than he intended. "What are you doing here, opening a restaurant 2 towns over?" Farm to table, very upscale. Derek's eyes swept over the bakery with the particular condescension of a man who'd once told Charlie that small-town baking wasn't a real career. Thought I'd stop by, see how the little operation's doing, maybe talk partnership. I could use a pastry supplier with your kind of local charm. I'm not interested. Come on, Charlie. We were good together before you got weird about your mom. Derek reached out, easy and familiar, and rested a hand on Charlie's shoulder. Right as the bell over the door chimed and Grant walked in, off shift, still in his fire department t-shirt, a bouquet of grocery store daisies in one hand that he'd clearly picked up on impulse, the plastic wrap still crinkling against his fingers. Charlie watched Grant's face do a complicated thing. See the daisies suddenly feel foolish in his hand. See Derek's hand on Charlie's shoulder. See Charlie not immediately shrugging it off because he'd been too startled to move, and watch something shutter closed behind Grant's eyes. Sorry, Grant said, voice carefully even. Didn't realize you had company. Grant, this isn't. It's fine. Grant set the daisies down on the nearest table, gentle, like he didn't quite trust himself not to crush them. I'll come back later. He left before Charlie could get the sentence out, the bell over the door jangling behind him, and Charlie stood there with Derek's axe hand still on his shoulder and felt something in his chest crack straight down the middle. He shoved Derek's hand off, 3 seconds too late to matter. You need to leave. Charlie. I mean it, Derek. I'm not interested in a partnership, and I'm definitely not interested in you. Get out of my bakery. Derek left, eventually, with an eye roll and a mutter about small-town people, his convertible peeling away from the curb with more drama than the moment deserved. Charlie stood alone in the quiet, staring at a bouquet of gas station daisies going slowly limp on the table, and felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely and thoroughly wretched. He texted Grant 3 times that evening. That wasn't what it looked like. Delete. Can we talk? Delete. I picked up the daisies. They're on my kitchen windowsill. Please come back. He deleted that one too, then sat on his kitchen floor with his back against the cabinets, phone in his lap, and let himself cry for exactly as long as it took the kettle to boil, because that was the rule he'd made for himself after his mother died. Grief got a timer, and then you got up and did the dishes anyway. Nora called around 9, having heard some garbled version of events from Eleanor, who had heard it from the woman who ran the flower shop Derek had definitely not bought his daisies at. Do you want me to come over? She asked. I can bring the good ice cream. The kind with the little caramel swirls. I'm okay, Charlie lied. You're allowed to not be okay? I know. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. I just don't know how to fix something I didn't even do wrong. Some things you can't fix by being right about them, Nora said, gently, in the voice she'd used since they were 7 years old and she'd first appointed herself his protector. Sometimes you just have to give it time and hope the other idiot figures himself out. She was right, as she generally was, though it would take Grant considerably longer to figure himself out than either of them would have liked. Grant didn't come by the next day, or the day after that. He thinks I'm getting back with Derek, Charlie told Nora miserably, elbow deep in a batch of dough he was kneading with far more aggression than the recipe called for. Which is insane. Derek is the worst person I've ever dated. I would rather date the dunk tank. Have you told him that? I texted him. He said, take your time, no rush, which is code for I am spiraling and pretending I'm not. Sounds like someone else I know, Nora said pointedly, and Charlie threw a handful of flour at her, which she dodged with the ease of long practice. The truth, underneath the frustration, was more complicated, and Charlie knew it even as he avoided sitting with it. There was a second thing tangled up in Grant's silence, something Nora had heard through the grapevine, and finally told him on the 4th day, gently, like she was diffusing something. Toby said the department's offering Grant a promotion. Battalion chief, back in Boston. Nora watched Charlie's face carefully. Big job, big money. His mom's still out there. His whole life used to be there, before his dad. She stopped. He hasn't said yes, but he hasn't said no either. Charlie set down the rolling pin very carefully because his hands had started to shake. He's leaving, Charlie said. He hasn't decided anything. He didn't tell me. That was the part that hurt worst, sharper than the idea of Grant leaving. That Grant had been sitting with something enormous, something that would determine the entire shape of both their futures, and hadn't said a single word. Charlie thought about scent bonds and fate, and the way his whole nervous system had rearranged itself around a stranger in a burning kitchen weeks ago, and thought, with a cold, sinking clarity, that maybe all of that had meant something different to Grant than it had meant to him. Maybe Grant had felt it too and decided, quietly, that it wasn't enough to build a whole life around. Not compared to Boston, not compared to the ghost of his father, not compared to the person he'd have been if the last 8 years had gone differently. He didn't reach out. Grant didn't either. 4 days became a week, and Woodstock in early November got cold and gray, and the bakery's corner table sat empty every afternoon, and Charlie told himself unconvincingly that he was fine. He threw himself into the bakery instead. New recipes he didn't need to test, inventory he didn't need to count twice, a display window he rearranged 3 separate times, until Nora finally took the seasonal gourds out of his hands and told him, not unkindly, to go take a walk before he alphabetized the flour. Twice he picked up his phone to text Grant something small and ordinary, the kind of nothing message they'd traded easily for weeks. The diner's doing a maple donut special, thought of you, and twice he put the phone back down, unsent, telling himself it wasn't his place to chase a man who might already be halfway to Boston in his head. Eleanor, for her part, made her opinion known daily, stopping by the bakery each morning, ostensibly for her usual coffee, and instead delivering a fresh update on Grant's mood via the town's ever-reliable grapevine. Toby says he hasn't smiled since Tuesday, she reported on day 3, entirely too pleased with the drama of it. Hank says he reorganized the entire equipment closet at the station out of what Hank is calling emotional distress. You two are going to be the death of me. He kept the recipe box closer than usual that week, thumbing through his mother's handwriting without actually baking anything from it, as though proximity to her steady, looping cursive might loan him some of her old certainty. On the 5th night he found a card he hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the gingerbread recipe. Love doesn't wait for the smoke to clear, sweetheart. It walks in anyway. He didn't know when she'd written it, or for whom, but he cried over the sink for 10 straight minutes and didn't call anyone to explain why. Business, at least, didn't care about heartbreak. The bakery still opened at 6, the oven still needed tending, and Charlie found a strange comfort in the mindlessness of it, the reliable arithmetic of flour and yeast and time, the way a good loaf of bread would rise whether or not its baker's chest ached while he shaped it. He caught himself, twice that week, reaching automatically for the good coffee beans he'd started keeping just for Grant's afternoon visits. And both times he had to stop, hand on the cabinet, and remind himself that the corner table was for now just a table. Eleanor's daily reports didn't stop, either, though they shifted from gossip to something gentler, less, here is precisely how miserable he looks, and more, here is exactly why you two belong together. Delivered with the patience of a woman who had clearly seen this particular kind of stubbornness before, in other couples, in other decades, and knew it always sorted itself out eventually, one way or another. On the 7th night, Charlie sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, and made a decision he should have made days earlier. He would not wait for Grant to sort himself out in silence. Whatever this was, mate bond, fate, 4 seconds that had rearranged his whole nervous system. It deserved better than 2 grown men too proud and too scared to say what they actually meant. He didn't yet know that Grant had already turned down Boston that very morning, 3 hours before Eleanor came storming into the bakery to deliver the news. He only knew that he was done sitting quietly with a full heart and an empty corner table, and that whatever happened next, he intended to be the one to walk toward it. It was Eleanor Whitfield, in the end, who forced the issue, striding into Bennett's bakery on a Thursday afternoon with the particular energy of a woman who had run out of patience for young people's nonsense. You, she said, pointing at Charlie, are going to the firehouse. Right now. Eleanor, I'm in the middle of. I don't care if you're in the middle of the second coming, you're going to the firehouse. Because that boy has been walking around town for a week, looking like someone shot his dog, and Toby Reyes told my grandson that Grant turned down the Boston job this morning, and hasn't told a single soul why. And I refuse, to watch 2 idiots in love ruin a perfectly good love story over a misunderstanding about a man in a convertible. Charlie's hands went still on the counter. He turned it down? This morning. Now go. Eleanor practically shoved him toward the door. I'll watch the register. Go, before I change my mind and let you two suffer, which frankly you deserve after making me wait a week for this. Charlie ran the 6 blocks to the firehouse without his coat, breath fogging in the November air, past the hardware store, and the little bridge, and the diner where Hank waved at him through the window, with an expression that suggested he already knew exactly where Charlie was headed and approved wholeheartedly. Toby met him at the firehouse's side door before he even reached it, arms crossed, blocking the way with the theatrical seriousness of a man who had clearly been waiting all morning for precisely this moment. "He's out back," Toby said. "And if you two don't sort this out today, I am personally going to lock you both in the equipment closet until you do. I have the keys. I will use them." "Noted," Charlie said, already moving past him, and found Grant out back, alone, methodically coiling a hose with the particular focus of a man, trying very hard not to think about something. "You turned down Boston," Charlie said, breathless, and Grant's hands stilled on the hose. He turned around slowly. Up close, he looked tired in a way Charlie hadn't seen before, the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept well in a week. "Yeah," Grant said. "Why didn't you tell me you were even considering it? Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to talk me out of it." Grant set the hose down, ran a hand through his hair, and because, Charlie, I saw that guy's hand on your shoulder and every insecure, ugly part of me thought, of course. Of course he'd want someone like that instead, someone who isn't married to a job that killed his own father. I panicked. I've been panicking for a week, and it was stupid, and I'm sorry. "Derek is nothing," Charlie said fiercely, closing the distance between them. "Derek is a man who left me the second things got hard, and you are the only person who has ever run toward things when they got hard. And I have spent this entire week feeling like I imagined the whole last 2 months because you wouldn't even text me back. I didn't want to make it your decision," Grant said. "Boston, staying, any of it. I didn't want you to feel like the weight of my whole life was on you." "Grant." Charlie took his face in both hands, flour-dusted and cold from the walkover, and made Grant look at him. "You're my mate. I felt it in the first 4 seconds too, remember? That means the weight of your life is on me now, the same way mine is on you. That's not a burden. That's what this is. I want to carry it. I want you to let me." Grant's eyes had gone glassy, and he pressed his forehead to Charlie's, breathing unsteadily for a long moment before he could trust his own voice again. "I keep waiting to wake up," he admitted, quiet, almost embarrassed by it. "Every single day since that first morning. Like it's too good to actually be mine." "It's yours," Charlie said. "It's ours. Wake up already, Sullivan. You're missing it." Something in Grant's face cracked open, raw and unguarded, and he pulled Charlie in against his chest, so fast the air left Charlie's lungs in a rush. "I turned down Boston 3 hours ago," Grant said into his hair, voice thick. "Before I even knew you'd come find me. I couldn't do it. I stood in my kitchen with the offer letter, and all I could think about was cinnamon rolls and flour on your nose, and how I didn't want to build a life anywhere you weren't in it. That's the least stoic, most ridiculous thing I have ever heard a fire chief say," Charlie said, laughing wetly against his shoulder. "I'm allowed exceptions," Grant reminded him, and kissed him there in the cold behind the firehouse, slow and certain, while somewhere behind them Toby whooped loud enough to be heard 3 streets over, and Hank started a slow, deeply unnecessary round of applause. "For what it's worth," Grant murmured against his hair once the applause had died down. "I want you to know it wasn't a hard choice, in the end. Boston was the job I thought I was supposed to want. This," he pulled back just far enough to look at Charlie properly, cheeks still cold, eyes not, "this is the thing I actually want. I just needed a week of being an idiot to remember the difference." "You're allowed 1 week of being an idiot," Charlie said. "Lifetime limit. Use it wisely. Already spent it." "Good. Let's not do that again." "Deal," Grant said, and sealed it with another kiss unhurried, while the November wind picked up around them and neither of them felt the cold at all. The months that followed were, by mutual and enthusiastic agreement, the easiest of both their lives. Grant's corner table became a fixture rather than a visit. Coffee every afternoon, dinner most nights, his uniform jacket eventually migrating to a hook by Charlie's back door so permanently that Nora started calling it the husband hook, months before either of them had used the word out loud. Eleanor took to introducing them, unprompted and with tremendous satisfaction, as the 2 boys I personally put together, to which Grant had learned to simply nod along rather than argue the finer points of causality. 6 months later, on a warm evening in May, Grant proposed at Bennett's bakery. After hours, kitchen lights dimmed, flour dusted across the counter from the batch of cookies they'd deliberately, ceremonially burned just slightly at the edges. the way they always did now, as a kind of running joke that had become its own sweet tradition. I looked up the actual statistics, Grant said, kneeling on the flour-dusted floor with a small box in his hand, entirely serious, on how many people meet their mate during a structure fire. It's very low. Statistically, I should probably still be single, or possibly dead, given my track record with open flames. Is this the proposal or a fire safety lecture? Both, Grant said. I contain multitudes. Charlie Bennett, will you marry me, burnt cookies and all? Charlie, laughing and crying in roughly equal measure, said yes before Grant had even finished getting the ring out of the box, and Nora, who had been checking the walk-in for suspiciously long, and who Charlie later learned had been recruited as lookout by Grant 3 weeks prior, burst through the kitchen door, screaming loud enough to summon Eleanor from 2 blocks away. They were married the following October, on the town green, under the same maple trees that had gone gold and red for the Harvest Festival the year they'd met. Charlie spent the morning of the wedding exactly the way he spent every morning, up at 5, moving through the bakery kitchen by muscle memory, except this time it was a single small wedding cake instead of 60 dozen cinnamon rolls, iced with his mother's steady hand guiding his own, or so it felt, her recipe box open on the counter beside him like a silent witness to the whole thing. Grant, he learned later, had spent his own morning at the firehouse, polishing his dress boots the department way, the way his father had taught him before he was old enough for kindergarten, murmuring something under his breath that Toby swore, though he'd never admit it sober, sounded suspiciously like a prayer of thanks. Toby stood as best man, giving a speech that somehow involved both a fire safety PSA and 3 separate crying breaks. Nora stood as Charlie's maid of honor, wearing a dress the exact shade of blueberry pie, filling as a private joke only 3 people at the wedding understood. Eleanor Whitfield sat in the front row, looking as smug and satisfied as a woman who had personally engineered the entire romance, because, as she reminded absolutely everyone who would listen, she basically had. Charlie wore his mother's old apron under his suit jacket, just at the collar, where only Grant would notice, and when Grant did notice, mid-vow, voice cracking, he reached up without thinking and pressed his palm flat against Charlie's chest, right over the apron string, the same gesture from the very first day, steady hand against smoke-stung lungs, except this time nothing was burning except both of them, gently, gladly, on purpose. The reception spilled out across the green under strings of warm little lights, long tables laid with more of Charlie's baking than any sane caterer would have allowed, and somewhere around 10 o'clock, when the band had slowed and most of the town had wandered off into contented, cider-warmed conversation, Grant pulled Charlie out onto the grass for one more dance neither of them were any good at. Regrets? Grant murmured against his temple, swaying more than actually dancing. One, Charlie said. I should have let the cinnamon rolls burn on purpose years ago. Would have saved us both a lot of time. Grant laughed, low and warm, and Charlie felt it more than heard it, chest to chest, steady as a heartbeat. Above them the maple trees had gone bare enough to let the stars through, and somewhere behind them, Eleanor was telling anyone who'd listen exactly how she'd known, from the very first morning, that this was how it would end. 3 years later, the smoke alarm in the little house on Maple Street went off at 6:52 in the morning, which Charlie would later insist was, if nothing else, a slight improvement on their record. It's fine, Grant bellowed from the kitchen, in the exact tone of a man who had just discovered that fire chiefs were not, in fact, immune to the specific chaos of a stand mixer left running unattended. Everything is under control. Charlie arrived in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas to find his husband of 3 years standing in the wreckage of what had once been, ambitiously, a batch of anniversary pancakes. Batter on the ceiling, batter on the dog, batter, somehow, on the outside of the closed refrigerator door, waving a dish towel at the smoke detector with the grim determination of a man defusing a bomb. You're supposed to be the fire expert, Charlie said, leaning against the doorframe, unable to keep the grin off his face. I am an extinguishing expert, Grant said with as much dignity as a flour-covered man could muster. Prevention was never really my department. Their dog, Biscuit, a scruffy rescue mutt, Toby had talked them into adopting the previous spring, who had developed an unfortunate and very specific taste for pancake batter, chose that moment to attempt, and fail, to lick batter off the side of the cabinet, sliding sideways into the cabinet door with a thump that made both men burst out laughing. "Happy anniversary," Grant said, giving up on the smoke detector and crossing the kitchen instead, pulling Charlie in against his chest, utterly unbothered by the batter, transferring from his shirt to Charlie's. "I had a whole plan. There was going to be pancakes shaped like—" He stopped. "Shaped like what? It doesn't matter now. They're on the ceiling." "Shaped like what?" Grant Sullivan. "Hearts," Grant admitted, going faintly, satisfyingly red. And Charlie laughed so hard he had to lean into his husband's chest just to stay upright. "Of course they were," Charlie said, wiping his eyes. "You're the least subtle man I've ever loved, I contain. If you say multitudes one more time, I'm telling that story at your retirement party." "You wouldn't. I absolutely would. I'd bring visual aids." Grant laughed, low and warm against the top of Charlie's head, and for a moment they just stood there in the wreckage, batter drying on the ceiling, Biscuit gnawing hopefully at a fallen spatula, the smoke detector finally, mercifully falling silent. And Charlie thought about how strange it was, the shape a life could take. 2 years ago he'd stood in this same kind of morning chaos and thought his whole world had gone up in smoke along with his mother's absence. Now smoke just meant Tuesday. Now smoke meant a husband who couldn't cook to save his life but tried anyway, every single time, because trying was the whole point. Biscuit chose that exact moment to knock the empty mixing bowl off the counter with his tail, sending it clattering across the tile in a way that startled all three of them, and Grant, instinctively, ridiculously, after 11 years in the fire service, dropped into a half-crouch like the bowl might reignite. Charlie laughed so hard he had to grab the counter for balance, and even Grant, once he'd registered what he'd just done, couldn't help laughing at himself too. Hands still braced, like he was bracing for a structural collapse from a stainless steel mixing bowl. "I love you," Charlie said, when he'd recovered enough to speak, batter-smeared and smiling up at the only man who'd ever set off every alarm in his life in the very best way. "Even when you're setting our kitchen on fire at 7 in the morning." "To be fair," Grant said, echoing a very old argument, pressing a kiss to Charlie's temple, "it's barely on fire. It's basically a large candle. That's not funny. It's a little funny." It was, Charlie had to admit, wiping a smear of batter off his husband's jaw before kissing him properly. Exactly a little funny. And exactly, entirely, everything he'd never known to hope for, standing barefoot in a smoke-hazed kitchen with the man who'd walked into his burning bakery 3 years ago, and simply, quietly, never left. They ended up at the diner instead, the one with pancakes Grant still privately called sadness and regret, sharing a booth by the window while Biscuit waited, unrepentant, in the truck. Eleanor waved at them through the glass on her way to open the store, and Nora texted a photo of her daughter's Halloween costume 3 months early because she'd already started planning, and somewhere behind the counter a radio played something slow and sweet that reminded Charlie, absurdly, of a fiddler at a Long Ago festival. "You know," Grant said, stealing a piece of bacon off Charlie's plate with the shameless ease of a man who'd been doing it for 3 years, "Toby asked me the other day if I regretted turning down Boston." Charlie went still, fork halfway to his mouth. "What did you say?" "I said the only thing I regret is that it took me a whole miserable week to figure out something that should have been obvious in 4 seconds. Grant reached across the table and laced their fingers together, familiar and easy, the same gesture from the festival 3 years ago, worn smooth now with repetition. "Every single morning I wake up in that ridiculous batter-covered kitchen, and every single morning I think the same thing. I'd choose this again. All of it. Even the pancakes on the ceiling. Even the smoke alarm? Especially the smoke alarm," Grant said. "It's basically our song at this point." Charlie laughed, warm and unguarded, and squeezed his husband's hand under the table, and thought that if 19-year-old Grant, standing in the wreckage of his own father's death, could have seen this exact moment, a diner booth, cold coffee, a dog waiting patiently in a pickup truck, a whole ordinary Tuesday stretched out ahead of them, he might have understood, finally, that running toward the fire had led him somewhere worth arriving. Somewhere back on Maple Street, the smoke alarm had finally gone silent, and Biscuit had given up on the batter, and the morning went on, ordinary and golden and entirely, ridiculously theirs.